Welcome to another installment of the Historical Society of the New York Courts podcast series, Chatting with the Authors. Today, we're talking to another author of one of the pieces from Judicial Notice. If you don't know, Judicial Notice is our signature publication. We do it annually and feature a lot of great pieces. I'm Eric Vandervoort, the Society's Communication Strategy Fellow. I'm a scholar of legal history and a bunch of other things, but today I don't really matter. It's March 22nd, 2024, and today we're talking with Professor Mary Noé. Mary is a lawyer and professor in the undergraduate legal studies program at St. John's. She's a native of Brooklyn and a former administrative law judge at the New York State Office of Professional Medical Conduct. Her forthcoming book is Arsenic, Anarchy, and the Assassin, The Man Who Shot J.P. Morgan, and I will ask her to talk about that very briefly toward the end of the podcast. But today we're going to be talking about a much different topic. Mary's article in Judicial Notice called Murder at Madison Square Garden, which is about Harry Thaw's trial for the murder of Stanford White, and so much more. Professor Noé, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I told you before we started talking, I'm a huge fan of true crime. This is a story that I'd never heard before, and it just, every paragraph in the article that I read was like another piece of, what now? What? We're going to? But so before we get to that, I want to just invite you to tell us a little bit about the context of what we're in, because we're at an interesting time where the world had changed and then the world was just about to change again. It's a Gilded Age just coming to an end. It's a pre-war era, and it's such an interesting time in New York. So can you sort of set the stage for us of just the world we're in?
Well, in fact, there were lots of people that were becoming very, very rich at the time. And the interesting part of this story is that you have two very prominent, well-known, wealthy men. Mm-hmm. Harry Thaw's father was one of the first investors in something that you may be familiar with or have heard of. It's called the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so he had lots and lots of money. And this was a time when Paris was booming, and he spent some time in Paris. And Stanford White was an architect and had made some, and he was part of a law firm, an architectural firm called McKim, Mead and White. Mm-hmm. And some of his architectural masterpieces still exist today. The Washington Memorial Arch, the Gould Library at NYU, and the one that he actually got shot at, which was Madison Square Garden. But just to give you an idea of this fantastic group of people that are involved here, was Harry Thaw's father was married first time, and his wife died. He had 5 children. And then he married Mary, and she had 6 children. She was 25 years younger. And when he died in 1899, Harry's father left $12 million, which today would be somewhere in the area of a little bit more than $400 million. Okay? And in fact, there's a Thaw telescope, because he was really a great donor of science and the arts and things like that. But Harry was a bit of a problem. He was at the time his father's death in 1889 receiving about $8,000 a month as an allowance. And so, but Harry's behavior was always somewhat maniacal. Mm-hmm. He had temper tantrums, chronic insomnia. He got into Harvard because of his father's money, but he was walked off the campus because there was rumors he was molesting young men on the campus. And so once he went off the campus, then he was on to Europe, and he was known to have some sexual sadism type of lifestyle. Mm-hmm. But he would pay off prostitutes. So he would whip them and gag them and handcuff them, often whipping them until they're bleeding, but he would pay them off so that everybody was quiet. When he came to New York, he was called Mad Harry, and he was banned from the red light district in New York. And so that gives you a little bit of background of Harry. Now, Stanford White is an interesting guy because he's a great architect. He's the son of a Shakespearean scholar, and his mother was actually an attorney. And he built these beautiful, beautiful masterpieces. And in fact, he had Madison Square Garden topped with a scandalous 13-foot naked statue of Diana shooting a bow and arrow. And they actually took it down because it was so scandalous. It's currently, if you're interested, want to take a look at it, it's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
Well, I've seen it.
You've seen it?
The one, yeah.
Wow. Oh, wow. He also had a great appetite for sexual excesses with young girls. So, and his daughter called him out of control. His granddaughter wrote a book about him and said that he was out of control. So there's the two men, and now enters this beautiful nymph, as she was called, Evelyn Nesbit. She was born actually in 1884, and she grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with her mother and her brother, and her father, who was an attorney. But her father died at 40 years old and left them destitute. And it was no time at all that people picked up on Evelyn's inherent beauty. She was this spectacular, sensuous-looking young woman. And so Evelyn's mother brought her to New York with her brother, and she quickly became a model. And in fact, she was America's first pinup girl. And she was in Vogue and in all kinds of magazines as a model. And then in 1901, in May of 1901, she actually landed a job as a chorus girl for a Broadway show. And that's where she caught the eye of Stanford White. And so he was 47 and she was 16. And he would invite her and her mother back to his apartment on 24th Street, West 24th Street, 22 West 24th Street. And he was financially very supportive of the family and Evelyn, which they would really needed at the time. And this is where supposedly on the second floor he had the red velvet swing attached to the ceiling beam. And she would go on the red velvet swing and he would push her. And eventually Evelyn's mother got to trust him as almost like a father. And one night, now this is unclear whether he got her so intoxicated or whether he put something in her drink that she fell unconscious and he raped her. And she woke up and she screamed and he said, "Don't worry, I'm going to take care of you. You're mine. You belong to me. It's not a problem." But Stanford had an eye for him. And so it was no time at all before he wasn't that interested in her. But there was someone who was an unknown that was somewhat interested in her. And he really wasn't making it in the acting field right now. And his name was Barrymore, John Barrymore. And he actually proposed to her, but her mother wouldn't allow it because he had absolutely no money. He was an unknown. So John Barrymore in 1902 is off the scene. And now enters, she's in another show, one Harry Thorpe. And Harry would send her flowers and jewelry and tried everything he could to persuade her. And Evelyn's mother was quite persuaded because he was clearly a very wealthy man and part of this, the golden age where champagne flowed and it was just magnificent. And there was, at one point in 1903, he takes Evelyn and her mother to New York. And he convinces her mother to stay in London while he takes her on to Germany and takes her to Kassenstein Castle. And there she tells him that she's not a virgin anymore. And he goes crazy and he starts whipping her. Now, when she comes back, she goes to Stanford, and Stanford tells her, "You have to go to an attorney." And she goes to an attorney and she completes an affidavit describing what, in fact, Harry did to her. Mm-hmm. But Harry wins her back somehow or another, and she tells the attorney to burn the affidavit. And on June And then they actually get married on, I think it's April of 1905.
Okay.
Harry and Evelyn are married. And they actually moved to Pittsburgh, but they come back to New York. And then on June 25th, 1906, they're at Madison Square Garden, in the rooftop, watching the theater, and Harry takes out his gun, goes over to Stanford White, and shoots him.
In front
And
of how many witnesses?
hundreds,
I think the article might
hundreds of
probably
witnesses.
thousands.
Witnesses, absolutely.
But there's no question that he did
There's
it.
no question that he did.
Yeah.
No question. And so he's taken over to the tombs, and
The
you
tombs are,
know,
for our listeners, the tombs are,
it's actually the New York City jail that still exists today. Okay. And so he's taken over to the criminal, the jail cell there in New York City, and waiting for trial. And that was June 1906. And I guess trial courts moved a lot faster than they did nowadays. So in January 1907, he has the trial. But the cast of characters now in the trial now shift to even a stranger group of people. Okay.
right, the judge, the first judge, and this is a spoiler a little bit for our listeners, the first judge of many is no angel himself.
No, he is not. He, in fact, Judge Fitzgerald was missing like 5 months before, and he had been found in contempt of court because while he was practicing law, he did not give an accounting of an estate that he had done. And also he owed money for law books, and he owed money to the cleaners, and he owed money all over the place. Somehow or another he was appointed to sit on this case. And part of Harry's dream team was this attorney who's called the Napoleon of the California Bar. Delphin Delmas was his name. And so he comes up with this theory of the case, which is that Harry has dementia Americana. That's his defense, because he's clearly shot him. No one's denying any of that.
And you call that in the piece, you call it an attorney invented diagnosis, I think.
It is. It is an attorney diagnosis. The prosecutor, Jerome, his theory is that this was based on jealousy. But just because it's just so incredible, and actually you find that later on in the story, the American public buys this. I'd love just to read you this one description of how Delmas defines dementia Americana. He says, it's a species of insanity which makes every home sacred, and whoever stains the virtue of a husband's wife has forfeited the protection of human law. And there it was. So there's your first defense. And Evelyn testifies about Harry. She gets up there and testifies, and her testimony is all over the newspapers, and it's quite dramatic. She's teary-eyed and telling her story about the encounter that she had with Stanford White, and she's describing what happened that night and the red velvet swing. And so
do we know in her testimony if she was describing her longer relationship with White, or was she focused on the assault? And
she focused more on the assault of what happened, and how her husband, when she told her husband about what Stanford had done to her, he was biting his nails, and he was going to commit suicide. And so she's describing how distraught he was, and how awful, that what impact it had, and how now her husband was just so focused on Stanford White, because he had not only done this to her, but he had done this to other women as well, young girls. And so so she has this enormously dramatic appearance in court, which is really, really great. this tearful testimony, and women bow their heads because they're so embarrassed by some of this testimony she
And we
gives.
have in the piece, we've got two photos of Evelyn
Yes,
hearing her, because as you described her earlier, this sort of sylph, this sort of it girl, really, in some ways, right? And she's dressed, it's not quite flapper era, but it has that vibe of somewhere between Gilded Age and flapper, of just a young woman in maybe a party outfit or something, very fun and loose. Whereas on the bench, she's dressed in a much more traditional, a sort of nice hat and very high-necked blouse or dress or something like that. Much more.
exactly. You're exactly right. And in fact, the prosecutor, the district attorney in Manhattan, tries to get her to say that she posed nude. And she never admits to that she was a model and posed nude. So you're absolutely right how she dressed, but beautiful clothes because at this point now she has lots and lots of money. So that first
Proper,
trial, I'm sorry,
proper lady.
properly, absolute proper right. That first trial ends on April 10th, 1907, and the jury deliberates for 47 hours, and it's deadlocked, and it's a hung jury.
Mhm.
And so now Jerome, District Attorney Jerome, is determined to get Harry Thorpe. And so there's a second trial that starts literally a year after the first trial. And so this time, though, they're going to plead the insanity defense. Okay, he gets another new attorney, a new attorney, and this man called Littleton, who's from Texas. He was a rail splitter, and he came to New York, and he was actually worked in the district attorney's office. And so his defense is that that Harry was insane. And the insanity defense at this point in time is that the defendant has the presumption of sanity. The defense counsel must prove that the defendant is insane. Once he brings forth that evidence that the defendant is insane, then the burden flips over to the district attorney, to the prosecutor, and they must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not insane. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. I mean, well, in the context, yes. One question I do have, because we're talking about a world, he's a wealthy man. A lot of the people that are the attorneys and the judges and the folks that are looking at, I mean, maybe not the jurors, let's say, but as you mentioned, he had a long-standing reputation as Mad Harry. So are everyone in this world, do we know if they're sort of like, oh, this guy actually should be pleading insanity, or do we have any view into that? Of
Well, that was that was his best defense because he obviously shot
Right.
Sticks' wife, and and in fact, the prosecutor at the first trial called, I think, 3 or 4 people: his son, one of the witnesses, the person, one of the medical people who dealt with Stanford White, and he said, like, what's to do here, really? He shot him and cold blood, and that was it. And
Yeah.
so, but now he's going to do an insanity defense, which I'm not sure that the prosecution was so adverse to. And so, what they do is they roll out all of these people that start talking about Harry and his young life. And his mother gets on the witness stand and she talks about how he had such strange behaviors, and the family has a history of insanity and their relatives in asylums. His baby nurse talks about how he was moody and nervous and he twitched. His kindergarten teacher talks about how he tore up his clothes and threw chairs. And the mathematics teacher spoke about how he zigzagged and walked. There were physicians and alienists at the time, that those are psychiatrists, and they spoke about how when he was in Paris, he attempted to commit suicide. And other doctors then claimed that he was suffering from mania, paranoia, and some other diseases of the mind. Manic depressive insanity. And so there you go. In the second trial, 1 month later, the jury found him not guilty by reason of consent. Right then and there, the judge signs an order for Harry to go into Madison, which is a hospital for the criminally insane in New York. And right then and there, his attorneys get up and say, we want a hearing because we believe Harry is sane right now. And that actually, the judge denies it, and that's appealed. And in fact, they said he's not entitled to that hearing. And so now Harry, that's when Harry files writ after writ after writ of habeas corpus. Not only is one writ denied, he appeals the writ, and then he files a new writ. So he appeals the old writ and files a new writ. And this goes on, and he literally makes a mockery of the legal system.
Yeah.
But he's not getting out, and he's getting a hearing, and the judges are listening to the best psychiatrist you could pay for, Harry's best psychiatrist, and also the psychiatrists that are actually treating him at Madison Hospital and saying that he's insane.
And it's important to note here that he's got essentially infinite resources.
Infinite amount of resources.
He can,
Infinite amount of resources.
again, a line that stands out to me is that he said something like, as long as I can find willing attorneys and unscrupulous experts, I'll just flood the system with writ after writ. So this is the start of a multi-year just flooding the courts, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And certainly the prosecutor and the state attorneys it's difficult for them. I'm amazed how much they actually did do in this case in light of the fact that they're getting bombarded. Okay. It's like incoming, constantly incoming. But Harry doesn't like staying in Madison, and he doesn't like staying in the hotels that he has to stay in when he has to go for the hearings. There's ongoing hearings constantly. So in August of 1913, he decides to use what's called self-help. And so he goes to Canada. And now he's got and as soon as he crosses over to Canada, he is arrested. Yeah. And
this is an escape, right? This is an escape.
He's escaped. And so he's arrested. But he's happy to be in Canada, and he wants to really stay in Canada. So he gets attorneys there to tie up the system, and they're just buzzing around. They're not quite sure what to do with him. And at some point, which I think is hysterical, it's about a month later, the Canadians, and he's been in all kinds of court and has appealed it, same kind of thing that he does in New York. And at some point, the Canadians, in the middle of the night, pull him out of jail, put him in a car, drive him over the United States border, and say, don't come back to Canada again. We're done with you, okay?
And was he in Canada? He was in Quebec, or he was in Ontario?
Quebec, yes.
So he's dealing with a more civil law system there as well. So it's not exactly corollary to New York, but he's just working both common and civil law systems to the extent that he can just throw money at the problem. He's
just throwing the money at the problem, getting all kinds of attorneys. So he actually winds up in Vermont, but there are reporters that are following him, and he gets in the reporter's car and he says, take me to New Hampshire. So now he goes to New Hampshire, and I just want to read this to you because I think it's so great. The New York Times on September 18th, 1913, Concord, New Hampshire, they say, throngs cheer him at station on the way. One woman tries to kiss his hand. Put him in a throne room. And the Atlanta Constitution, another newspaper, on September 18, 1913, says Harry Thor greeted by cheering crowds. And so he's like a hero, a cult hero. They love him in New Hampshire. So what happens in New Hampshire? Of course, Jerome had actually followed him up to Canada, and now he's going to follow him to New Hampshire. and they want to start extradition.
And
Okay.
this when Jerome had sought, I don't know, deputization as an attorney general around this
Yes, well, he did that. Yes, he did that actually to get into Canada,
time.
and
Right.
now he
It's
does it
hard to keep
again.
track of this man moving around a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, interstate extradition from one state into another is actually governed by the extradition clause of the United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 2. And this is actually between governors. Okay, the governors actually do this. It's kind of removed a little bit from the judicial system, and it's part of the executive system. And so we have the judge there in New Hampshire, and of course he's got a barrage of attorneys. And this is in September of 1913. And and he's got public support, and he's got money going out to lots of businesses and people in the state of New Hampshire. And even in the state of New York, he gives money to the driver who drove him to Canada and their family.
He's even got public support and pressure on the New Hampshire legislature. Is that right?
Actually, the New York State Legislature,
Oh.
the people in New York get together and they propose a bill that should be before New York State because they don't want any more money spent on trying to get Harry Thor back to New York. And so the governor holds on to the case and has a hearing in October of 1913, and in November 1913, he signs the warrant that Harry should be extradited. But his attorneys had already filed a writ of habeas corpus in the federal court.
Well, they're so good at it now; they can just get it really quickly, right?
Now it's the federal court, and the federal judge, who's very sympathetic towards this person who had actually protected the public from this man who was defiling women. He actually holds on to the case from, I guess it's September 1913 until 1914, October 1914.
And Harry's
because Harry has this argument that how could he be guilty of this crime, to this conspiracy to escape, if he's insane and doesn't have the mens rea to actually commit a crime. Okay? And if in fact he isn't insane, then he hasn't escaped. He hasn't committed a crime. So they have this judge in New Hampshire, this federal district court judge, spinning. And the judge actually has a commission to determine if Harry is sane or insane. And so and in the meantime, they have pictures in the newspaper of Harry fishing and walking up the mountains and enjoying the sights in New Hampshire. And the people love him there. Absolutely. And so Evelyn is gone. She's no longer part of this. And she's no longer being funded, and so she's gone. And so Harry's enjoying his time in New Hampshire. He really doesn't want to go. And it is December 22nd, 1914, when Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivers the decision of the court that basically says, send Harry back to New York. He's been indicted. Let the people of New York decide what to do with him.
Yeah. So we end up all the way at the Supreme Court.
All the way at the Supreme Court. Harry has been in and out of so many courts, both in the United States and in Canada, and actually gets to the Supreme Court and gets Justice Wendell Holmes to issue the decision, which is, extradite him, send him back, let the people of New York decide what to do with him. And so what they do with him in that trial is they find him not guilty of committing that offense, And the judge tries to keep out the insanity of it, but the jury is totally sympathetic to Harry. And so he is found not guilty and sent back to Madison. And now they file a writ of habeas corpus asking for a hearing. And this time, and I think possibly a few times before, they demand a jury trial. Because you see, previously, all those hearings that they had were with judges. And the judges actually stood up to this and were not going to be bought off and had decided that he was insane. But he knew with the jury that he would absolutely, be able to persuade them. And he was. And so he was let go out of Madison. He was a free man. But unfortunately, 8 months later, he lures a young boy from the Midwest with a promise that he's going to pay for his college education and help him in engineering. And he takes him into the hotel and he whips him. And this boy is not afraid to speak out. And so, obviously, the district attorney is going to prosecute Harry, but Harry disappears. Harry's not nowhere to be found. And it's some months later, weeks later, actually, cleaning lady finds Harry in a hotel. And they asked to extradite him, but the governor says he's not sane. We can't extradite someone who's insane. And so then he spends years in an institution. And when he gets out, he willingly comes to New York. And a very famous district attorney called Pecori, who was part of the hearings that would later be in the news, he decides not to prosecute him. And so Harry doesn't get prosecuted for that crime. And he goes and he lives his life. And Evelyn eventually marries, but her marriage is short-lived. She had a child and she claimed it was Harry's, but there was no way that it was Harry's because he was in the institution. And she actually died in 1967, so she lives a long life. But it's quite a story, don't you think?
That is a wild ride. And you did a masterful job walking us through it, and the piece has a lot more detail in it as well. So we strongly encourage our listeners to read it. And I, sorry, there's so much going on there. It's this, so there's so much material here, but really central to the whole thing is the idea of insanity or sanity, and there's selective deployment of the arguments and his mental capacity at any particular time. But how do you think that played out in the history of the insanity defense in New York, and I guess more generally?
Right. Well, I think the insanity defense back then, it was just crazy for them to put the burden on the prosecutor. Once the defense brings out testimony of insanity or whoever it is, who they, in Harry's case, could clearly pay for whatever they wanted. They paid for everyone and anyone enormous amounts of money. I think ultimately his legal bills came to somewhere in the area of $100,000 back in those days, which was an enormous amount of money. So I think that was really, really difficult to have it then. Whereas then they changed it to the McNaughton rule, which is your ability to understand your actions and be in control of those actions at the time that you commit the offense. And like Harry, who thought that he was never going to get out of Madison, nowadays the insanity defense is rarely used because those people that may in fact be insane or suffer from mental illness or mental disease at the time of committing an act would rather go to court and get their sentence then claim insanity and be at a mental institution. And one of them, I think, that stands out perfectly is the Son of Sam. Are you familiar with the Son of Sam?
Oh,
Oh,
yes, 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 yes.
yeah, he's in the 1970s, and he was killing all these girls. I lived in Brooklyn. I knew him well. He came after some young girls, brunettes in Bensonhurst, where I grew up. And
Yeah,
so clearly, but he did not plead the insanity defense.
yeah,
And so now what's more common is whether or not a defendant is competent to stand trial. And that's a whole different thing than the insanity defense.
right.
And in fact, that then brings in the mental hygiene laws that we have today.
Yep.
And whether, and if a person can be treated, and if they can't be treated, and if they can't be treated and they're unable to stand trial because they don't understand or they can't assist in their defense, they're released. The last popular one to have claimed insanity defense was the Hinckley trial, which was the man who shot President Reagan.
Yep.
And he stayed in mental institution. He was just released, I think, like
Yep.
a year ago.
Years
So.
ago, and now he's launched a musical career with apparently some moderate success. Um, I'm going to ask you just to make a judgment of history here, just based on your research and what you know. Did Harry know what he was doing when he shot White?
When he shot White, oh, I think he was doing. But I think he definitely had a mental illness. I mean, he was whipping these young people, and the sexual obsession, strange disorder. And so I think he knew what he was doing when he shot him. I think he had his own reasons in that, he had defiled his wife, and, he was as crazy as what I'd like to ask you is, after hearing this and reading about it in the article or whatever, who was crazier, Stanford White or Harry Thorne?
That's a tough question because it's interesting to me because and we got a lot of background here that's not in the piece, particularly on White, and the fact that they're both, you can juxtapose them both, and they have a lot of the same tendencies, I guess we could say, of this sort of excess, and I would say that probably, in my mind, Thaw is more troubled. I think that would be a fair statement, but it's hard to evaluate that because we just get Thaw's more violent, Thaw's more malignant in society, I guess. So I'm gonna have to go down on that side, but it's hard to know. I don't know. It's a tough question.
They were really, really mentally ill people who really preyed on young women.
Yeah.
And that's the sad part about it. Evelyn Nesbit, of course, made this enormous story, but there were lots of women there. At one of the hearings, where they have for that Harry wants to prove that he's sane, one of the landlords comes in and testifies about how he used to rent a room and how he would bring women up to the room and whip them and torture them and then release them and let them go. And supposedly had a gold-studded kind of a belt or whatever. And she was afraid to come forward because they were so wealthy. They were really intimidating, an intimidating family. And his siblings also stood by him. So people were afraid of wealthy people in that age, and he certainly could afford the best of a legal representation, mental health representation, anything money could buy.
You could afford willing attorneys and unscrupulous experts.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, but I just wanted to also, because you had mentioned something about possibly thinking about this in terms of what goes on today. One of the things is the extradition, because it's been recent in the news. We have this case between this person in Arizona, the district attorney in Arizona, and the New York City District Attorney Bragg. And so the governors, as I said, are the ones still who have control of extradition. We now have a federal law, but it's still governed by the United States Constitution. And the reason why there is an exception here to this extradition is because he has committed a violent crime in Arizona as well. You see, Harry didn't commit any crimes in New Hampshire, so that set him apart. But once that, the person who has fled the jurisdiction has committed a crime in the second state, well, then there is a possibility that they will not get an opportunity to try him. And so basically the governors have backed off, even though it seems in the news that it's all about the district attorneys and one attorney making a statement against another attorney. It really is about the governors who have backed off of this and said, okay, let him be tried in Arizona. And as soon as he's tried there, then extradite him to New York and he could be tried here as well.
Yeah.
So that's, Harry has really touched on a lot of different areas of the legal system.
This is just a tremendous story. I mean, we even have a relative of Churchill involved. I mean, it's such a small world that we're in, and it's just all these little details that just jump out, and that really gives a sense of what a kind of upper echelons of society at the time were like. It was a small, wealthy, insular world, and we're just getting a vignette and insight into that. So this is tremendous. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's the more you read about it, the more details come out, the more interesting it is. And what I guess surprised me most was how welcomed and loved Harry Thor was. Everybody thought he was just grand because he slayed this horrible person who was going around in cold blood. And he was quite the architect. As I said, his beautiful architectural pieces are still in New York. They're still there.
Yeah.
So
And the jury may not have bought the dementia Americana piece, but it does seem some resonance with the people of New York, at least at the time.
it was. They signed a petition to stop District Attorney Jerome from going after Harry Thor in New Hampshire. They actually signed the petition. I mean, they got thousands of signatures on this petition in New York State to stop the district attorney from going after Harry Thor. Can you imagine? I mean, it's just, it really is truly incredible.
We do like a bad boy folk hero sometimes, I guess. Even if we don't, even if they're not a good person.
I guess so. And I guess that they weren't convinced that he was the deviant person that he was. They didn't have all the details that maybe now in hindsight we have. So maybe it was, but he really just shot him in cold blood right there at the theater.
Well, this is a tremendous story, lots of troubling pieces, and I'm glad that we know the full context so we don't have to celebrate him quite so much. But knowing the story is really important for a lot of reasons. Thank you, Professor Noé. This has been tremendous. For our listeners, this is the Historical Society of New York's podcast. If you want to read the piece, you can go to history.nycourts.gov. You'll find judicial notice there. I highly encourage you to do so, and we'll be back soon with another interview. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.